The sun rose over the bustling city of Selim, a place where time itself seemed to bend and twist like the narrow alleyways between ancient stone buildings. On this particular morning, the scent of fresh bread mingled with the sharp tang of metal as blacksmiths hammered their wares and merchants shouted their wares in the crowded marketplace. But amid the organized chaos of the city, there was one stall that stood apart from the rest, a stall neither too grand nor too shabby, but possessing an almost hypnotic allure. Its sign read simply, "Time for sale." Behind the stall sat a man who appeared utterly out of place in the frenzy of the marketplace. His suit was too neat, his tie a bit too tight, and his shoes too polished for anyone who spent any real time in this city. Yet, his eyes gleamed with a strange knowingness, and the air around him buzzed with an energy that suggested this man was not a mere vendor of trinkets. He was a time merchant, a being with the ability to sell something far more precious than goods, the commodity of time itself. The time merchant sat behind the stall with an air of disinterest as customers wandered past, oblivious to his presence. A few glanced at his stall with curiosity, but few dared to approach. Time, after all, was not something many people understood. And even fewer were brave enough to buy it. He smiled faintly. It had been a long time since he'd played the game of fate, the game where every move carried the weight of reality itself. Today, however, was different. Today, the opponent he was waiting for had arrived. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in tattered robes. His face was obscured by a hood, but his ancient hands, wrinkled and thin, emerged as he took a seat at the chessboard that had been set up at the center of the stall. The millennial elder had arrived. Without a word, the time merchant rose from his seat, his every movement smooth and deliberate. He placed a finely crafted chess set between them. The pieces gleamed with an otherworldly sheen, each one infused with a subtle, almost imperceptible glow. This wasn't just a game of strategy. It was a game of fate. "You're late," the time merchant said, his voice a mixture of amusement and challenge. The elder looked up, his eyes flashing with the wisdom of 1,000 years. "Time," he said in a voice that seemed to echo from the very depths of history, "is a concept meant to be broken, not followed. I take my time when I arrive." The merchant's lips twitched into a smile, but it wasn't one of humor. It was a smile that suggested he had already anticipated the elder's words. The chessboard between them shimmered as if it were alive, pulsing with the rhythms of the universe itself. The crowd had gathered around them, sensing the gravity of the moment. As they began the game, the atmosphere in the city shifted. People started to notice strange occurrences. A man who had just passed by a bakery found himself back at the same stand moments later, as though he had been caught in a loop. A child skipped along the street and then found herself standing still, unsure of how she'd arrived at this point in time. There were whispers in the crowd, whispers of strange happenings, whispers of magic, but no one dared to ask what it all meant. The time merchant made his first move, sliding his pawn forward with precision. He had expected this game to be a test of wit, of sharpness, but as the pieces began to move, it was clear that this would not be just any ordinary contest. Every move seemed to warp reality around them. "You always think in terms of outcomes," the elder said, his voice tinged with something approaching mockery. "You manipulate time like a child playing with a toy. But time is not a toy, merchant. It is a living thing, and it will not be controlled by anyone, no matter how clever they think themselves." The time merchant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he contemplated his next move. He had a deep understanding of time. He could stretch it, fold it, even reverse it. But he also knew there was something about the elder, a force far beyond his comprehension. The elder's mind was as ancient as the stars themselves, and his grasp on fate, far subtler than the merchant's crude manipulations, seemed to exist on a plane the merchant could only dream of understanding. The game unfolded slowly, each move carrying with it the weight of the universe. The pieces moved with purpose, no longer just pieces of wood and ivory. They were avatars of time itself, each one representing a different facet of existence. A knight, galloping across the board, was a moment in history that could never be reclaimed. A rook, standing tall, was a pillar of reality, holding up the weight of what was. The pawns, like little soldiers, represented the mundane march of everyday life, unaware of the grand schemes unfolding around them. The time merchant moved his queen, the most powerful piece in the game. "You see," he said, breaking the silence, "I've always had a knack for time. I don't just sell it, I shape it. Every moment can be bent to my will." The elder chuckled, a sound like the wind rustling through ancient trees. "You have the arrogance of youth, merchant. You think time can be shaped, bent, and folded like clay. But time is not an object to be controlled. It is a force, a current. You may think you can manipulate it, but the current always finds its way back to the sea." The merchant's lips curled into a sly smile. "We'll see about that," he muttered, and with a flick of his fingers, the board shifted. Suddenly, the world around them seemed to slow. The crowd, once buzzing with excitement, stood still, frozen in time. A single bird in the sky hung suspended, its wings flapping in slow motion. The merchant watched with satisfaction as his move began to unfold, but the elder's expression remained unchanged. He made his move, and the world around them snapped back into motion. "I've been alive for 1,000 years, the elder said, his voice cold, yet filled with something like pity. "You may have your tricks, merchant, but you do not understand the true nature of time. It is not a force to be controlled. It is a web to be woven, a tapestry to be appreciated. Every thread is interconnected. To pull one too hard is to unravel the whole." The time merchant paused, looking down at the board. The elder had just moved his knight, a seemingly simple maneuver. But as he looked closer, the merchant realized something unsettling. The board had shifted subtly, reality itself had been altered. Time, the very thing he sought to control, was slipping from his grasp. For the first time in a long while, the time merchant felt the faintest hint of unease. He had made countless trades, manipulated the very fabric of existence itself, but he had never encountered anything like this before. The elder was more than just a rival, he was a force of nature. "I will not lose," the merchant muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He picked up his pieces, moving them with greater purpose, his mind racing. But as the game wore on, something strange began to happen. The world around them seemed to warp with every move, as if the game was no longer confined to the chessboard. Time itself was bending in ways the merchant had never imagined. He could feel it, the subtle tremor in the air, the tension building, as if the very fabric of reality was under threat. And yet, it was a threat neither player had seen coming. It wasn't just a game anymore. The world around the two players began to pulse with strange energy, each moment stretching and folding like a fabric too worn to hold its shape. The time merchant's breath grew shallow as he watched the pieces on the board shift in ways he could not predict. Each move of the elder seemed to carry with it an inevitable force, a pull that no amount of time manipulation could fight against. The game was no longer just a contest of intellect. It was a reflection of something much deeper, something cosmic. The merchant made a move. His queen advanced, a bold sweep across the board. He'd played the game thousands of times in his life, bending time and bending reality to his will. But the elder's reaction was swift, his knight leaping into the air as if pulled by some unseen string. As it landed, the very air seemed to ripple, distorting time in ways that made the merchant's stomach churn. "You think you control time," the elder said, his voice soft, but carrying an undeniable weight. "But time is not yours to command. It is a river, ever moving, always flowing. You cannot stop it, you can only ride its currents." The time merchant clenched his fists, a faint tremor running through his knuckles. "You speak of things you don't understand," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I don't just ride the currents, I control them." The elder's lips twisted into the slightest of smiles. "Do you? Then explain this." With a subtle flick of his wrist, the elder moved his bishop. The world around them rippled again, but this time it was different. The landscape itself began to shift, slowly at first, but with increasing urgency. Buildings twisted like paper caught in a gust of wind. People in the marketplace paused mid-step, their faces frozen in expressions of surprise, confusion, or fear. A mother who had been holding her child's hand found herself suddenly alone, her child vanishing before her eyes. "What's happening?" the merchant whispered under his breath. He could feel the fabric of reality fraying around them. The game was no longer a game. It was a battle for something far greater than either player had anticipated. The elder's eyes gleamed with a cold, ancient wisdom. "You think that by playing with time, you can keep the world in place. But you are not playing with time, merchant. Time is playing with you." The time merchant stood up, his chair scraping sharply against the stone floor of the stall. His mind raced, thoughts tumbling over one another. His own moves, his attempts to control the timeline, had somehow fed into this chaos. But what was worse, the anomaly he had felt was growing, expanding with every passing second. "Is this your doing?" The merchant's voice was tight, his gaze narrowing. The elder did not answer immediately. Instead, he tilted his head, studying the merchant with a look that bordered on pity. "No. This is not my doing. But you have unleashed something much greater than either of us could have predicted. The anomaly. It's already here. We are the last ones to notice it." The merchant's mind raced back through the game, each piece, each move, every turn in their chess match. He remembered when the distortion had first started, when reality had begun to fray. It was right after the elder's knight made that impossible leap. That move, the merchant now realized, was not just a move, it was the key. The elder had known about the anomaly all along. "You knew," the time merchant said, his voice trembling now with a mix of frustration and realization. "From the beginning, you knew this would happen." The elder nodded slowly. "I have lived for 1,000 years, merchant. I have seen what happens when time is manipulated too carelessly. You are not the first to try to bend it. But you are the first to play a game with it, and in doing so, you have awakened something old and dangerous." The game board between them glowed, the pieces beginning to shimmer and pulse. The clock above the stall ticked loudly in the silence, its hands now moving erratically, out of sync with any measure of time the merchant had known. The merchant took a step forward. "I can fix it," he said, though his words felt hollow even to him. "I can rewind. I can reset everything back to where it was before this madness began." The elder shook his head slowly. "No, merchant. You cannot undo what is already in motion. Time cannot be unwound like a ball of yarn. If you try to rewind, you will only stretch the knot tighter. The anomaly will continue to grow until everything, past, present, future, collapses in on itself." The merchant's hands gripped the edge of the chess table, the pieces beneath his fingers feeling warm, almost alive. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to center himself. In his many years of manipulating time, he had never encountered a force like this. He had always been in control. But now, for the first time, he felt small, insignificant in the face of something vast and incomprehensible. "We have to stop it," he said, more to himself than to the elder. "We have to find a way to fix it before it's too late." The elder remained silent for a moment, his eyes focused on the swirling distortion around them. It was as though he could see something beyond the present, beyond the chessboard, beyond the chaos. "The game was never meant to be won," he said quietly. "It was meant to be understood." The time merchant looked at him, confusion clouding his features. "What do you mean?" "The pieces are not just pieces," the elder explained, his voice calm despite the growing tension. "They are not mere representations of strategy. They are threads of fate, each move you make sends ripples through reality. You, merchant, may be able to manipulate time. But I am not here to manipulate it. I am here to restore the balance." The merchant's mind was racing. "What balance? What are you talking about?" The elder's gaze softened. You are so focused on the control of time that you fail to see the broader picture. Time is not something to be bought and sold, merchant. It is a living force, a part of the universe's natural rhythm. When you tamper with it, you disrupt that rhythm. And when the rhythm is disrupted too violently, the fabric of everything begins to unravel. The time merchant took a deep breath, his thoughts slowly clearing. He understood now, he wasn't just playing a game with the elder. He was participating in something far greater. A cosmic dance of fate, a game played with the threads of reality itself. And if they didn't find a way to restore balance, it would all fall apart. His fingers hovered over the chessboard, his mind now working with a clarity he had not known before. He had made mistakes. He had played with time as though it were a toy, a tool to be manipulated for his own gain. But this anomaly, this cataclysm, was not the result of his actions alone. It was something far deeper. Something older. The elder leaned forward, his ancient eyes fixed on the merchant. "We must work together," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press on the very air between them. "We must combine our knowledge, our strengths. Only then can we restore the balance. Time cannot be controlled. It can only be guided." The merchant nodded slowly, feeling the full weight of the moment. For the first time, he saw the elder not as a rival, but as an ally. A necessary ally. "All right," the merchant said, his voice steady now. "Let's do this. Let's put the pieces back together." They both turned their attention to the chessboard, where the pieces had stopped glowing, now resting in stillness as though waiting for the next move. The merchant and the elder exchanged a silent understanding, their bond now clear. This was no longer a game. It was the fate of everything they knew. Together, they moved the first piece. The game was over. Reality began to shift, slowly at first, then more quickly as the balance was restored. The distortions faded, the chaos evaporating into the ether. The time anomalies, the twisting of the city, all of it began to settle back into place, and as the final pieces were placed, the time merchant and the millennial elder sat back, exhaustion settling over them like a heavy cloak. The game had not been won in the way either of them expected, but it had been played. And in the end, the balance was restored. The merchant looked up at the elder, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "We did it." The elder smiled faintly. "Yes, merchant. But remember, time is not something to be owned. It is something to be respected." As the two stood, the sun breaking through the clouds overhead, the game was over. But the story of time would continue. And the merchant and the elder would never forget the lessons learned on the chessboard of fate.